Hi, everybody. This is Krista. Welcome to Bad at Keeping Secrets. Today, I'm talking to Noreen Masud, who is just published this is your second book, but your first memoir, A Flat Place. You're a lecturer at the University of Bristol in England, and I really was excited to talk to you and about the book. Basically, you had me at moving through empty landscapes, naming complex trauma. And I think the invitation to think about our lives and how we cope and how we become the people that we are through experience is endlessly fascinating. And you do it, you couple, and correct me if I'm wrong, your lived experience with, what's it called when you couple it with space or landscape?
In Britain, we talk about nature writing as a genre. That's often,
I don't know
the equivalent in the US. Yeah. But that's vaguely in the genre into which it falls. Though one of the things I'm interested in doing in this book is sort of poking, I guess, at the conventions of nature writing. Who gets to go into nature and have big thoughts, and who usually doesn't, and who's welcome in those spaces and who isn't. But yeah, I think we've got a name for it basically in the UK, where you couple sort of memoir-y bits with thinking about nature or going into nature. Yeah, nature writing. There's special shelves for it here.
It's very new to me. And I feel almost embarrassed now that I didn't know that before talking to you.
No, it's a weird genre, and I'm not necessarily sure that it's a very useful genre. So don't worry about it. It's very interesting to hear that it's a very British specific thing. That's curious.
It could just also be outside of my conscious memory, but I kind of wanted to start in the book early on. You talk about how this isn't an inspirational story. I think you say something about what happens when the flame of hope is put out entirely. And I was wondering if you could kind of explore the sort of nature writing within the context of inspiration.
Yeah, well, I suppose there are two kinds of genres I was sort of thinking about when I wrote that, because there are two kinds of stories. Well, there's usually one kind of story that someone like me is sort of allowed to tell, really, where things used to be bad, but then I came to a place like Britain, and now they're great, through hard work and pulling myself up on my bootstraps and whatever, I managed to succeed. That was a story I was completely uninterested in telling. I actually kind of take exception to those stories a little bit, because I don't think I necessarily really believe in sort of personal hard work as some sort of panacea. I think one of the things I try and do in the book is to show that, if anything, if things do get better, it's often not because of what you've done, but because of structural things, because of huge luck, because of moments of support, because the world kind of came together in the right way at the right time. What I don't want to suggest at all is that you could read this book to be like, oh, I
can try just for adversity.
Yeah, that's it. That's the phrase, the Horatio Alger of flat landscapes. Yeah, that's so boring and wrong, actually. I think it's actually quite an unethical thing. I'm going to put myself in line here. I think it's quite unethical to write in that way, because it implies that the individual has the power to change their future in a way that's very convenient as the basis of the American founding myth, but is sort of politically abhorrent to me, actually. So that's one sort of writing I hadn't. Oh, sorry, I look like I interrupted you.
Oh no, I mean, I think for me, it places the onus on and you're setting yourself up for failure, because the onus is to you to make change and to do different when you can't. Like it's just not possible within the confines of how humanity and nature and systems interact with each other.
Yeah, how capitalism is, the way that capitalism has been organized to along the lines of the patriarchy and white supremacy, and any sort of shift in people's life circumstances is just a random thing, and no kind of lesson can possibly be learned from it. That's pretty much what I think. Yeah,
I think that's tricky, though. So I want to say that I do agree with you entirely. For myself, I'm not necessarily attracted to stories that end well. I've been thinking a lot about like why we love what we love and why we like why we're attracted to certain things. And I feel like that's something not to go back to the book, but when your father dies, this is a question that comes up for you. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe, I guess not necessarily the circumstances around your father's death, but maybe let's start at the beginning. Actually, I'm going to take that back and start off with, could you give us a little bit of history in terms of where you grew up? And I think when
Sure.
your psychologist, when you start seeing a psychologist when you're in Britain, you talk about how your life was strange
Mm.
for a person growing up in Pakistan, in Lahore, and also would be strange for a person growing up in Britain. And I was wondering if we could kind of talk about the foundations of what you felt separated you from other people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born and raised in Pakistan to a Pakistani father and a British mother. And I grew up in a big sort of extended family home with my grandparents, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins. And so far sort of so normal, but it was actually a really kind of weird setup. And these big extended family homes are very normal in Pakistan, but my father was a very strange man. He was an Anglophile. That was the big thing. He saw himself as fundamentally kind of superior to other Pakistanis. He believed that sort of other Pakistanis were very backward, and it was only through kind of science and westernization, actually, that the country could sort of improve. And so he was very sort of like, well, he was deeply controlling, as anyone who believes that it sort of almost certainly is. So he kept us very isolated. We weren't allowed to talk to the neighbors, anything like that. We weren't allowed to go over to friends' houses. We went to school during term time. We came home. That was it. Barely, I think, yeah, I just, I could probably count the number of times we went outside in a year on like to other things on maybe one hand. We also kept quite we were sort of discouraged really from spending much time with our extended family, even, the extended family in the same house. So we pretty much, so 6 of us really lived in 2 rooms. Well, say 5 of us shared 1 bedroom. All the women shared a room. My father had his own room. And then there was another room in which we lived, and that was pretty much it. And in this really isolated way, and we were hothoused. We were sort of put through sort of strange, long, abstract lessons and tested in strange ways. And there was a certain amount of medical, inappropriate and unoverseen medical intervention, possibly experimental. I don't know. The truth is, when I talk about my childhood, there's so much I don't know. There's so much that just happened, and I couldn't ask any questions about it. Strange things were always happening, and I can't answer any questions about it. And I have memories which are sort of half memories or seem impossible, and I can't prove what happened. So when I was 16, nearly 16, about a month from 16, my father disowned us. And in the book talks about how I make a decision not to talk about why, because it's not my story to tell about why we were disowned. But when that happened, my mother and my sisters and I moved back. Well, my mother moved back to the UK, where she'd been born and raised, and took us with her, and we all moved into my grandmother's house, my maternal grandmother's house. And I've been here in the UK ever since. So the book is about, it really starts around the age when I'm about 30, and things at that point had just become a little bit more secure than they had been. I just secured a 3-year postdoc in academia, which is, for a temporary job, pretty much as good as you can get. It's in the UK as in the US. It's permanent jobs in academia are hard to find. So a 3-year job is quite a coup. So everything should have been great, but it really wasn't great. And I kept thinking about Pakistan and kind of getting thinner and thinner and not being able to explain why I couldn't stop thinking about it, because it was a strange life, but nothing seemed to have happened. There was nothing I could point to and say, I'm feeling awful because of this particular thing that happened. All I had were absences, where memory should have been, where good experiences could have been, where connection could have been. My father was a sort of, I would say he was a normal amount of violent, it's, as I talk about in the book. It wasn't spectacular or sort of appalling. It was a normal amount of violent. It was, thinking on a global level, it was probably less violence than most people go through. So I couldn't demonstrate why I felt so bad. I couldn't explain it. And this is what I mean then about structural reasons for things getting better. Because I was in a 3-year job, I could afford to see a therapist for the first time in my life. That was a piece of massive luck. That was nothing to do with my personal triumph over adversity. I was able to afford a therapist. It's as simple as that. I went to her and she helped me understand that there was a name for this strange thing I was feeling. There was, if I wanted to use it, and that's something I talk about in the book as well, so feelings of ambivalence about the term complex PTSD for me personally. But yeah, the term complex PTSD refers not to a single event, which was the difficulty I was having. There was nothing I could point to and say, this is the landmark in the landscape of my life that explains everything. It was just a kind of, to adopt the language of the book, there was a flat place where one might expect things to be able to point to. But complex PTSD is different from, I guess, non-complex PTSD, because it is so many things over a long period of time. Often it started before you were old enough to understand what counts as an event, what counts as a landmark in your life. Often they're things which seem maybe quite small in themselves, but cumulatively build up to something. It's also associated with, it's often, complex PTSD is associated with, the harm was done to you by a caregiver or someone who should have looked after you. And it's often associated with a sense that escape is impossible. It's absolutely, it was like, absolutely, we felt like prisoners. I felt like a prisoner, and I didn't think things would ever get any better than how things were when I was little. So my therapist helped me, gave me a word for things. And once you've got a word that you might or might not choose to use, then you can find a way into language, I guess.
Yeah.
And one of the, yeah.
Oh, no, keep going. I was going to ask you about if you could talk a little bit more about why you kind of felt adverse to using complex PTSD.
There's a few reasons. I think the first few, like, Liz, I'm sorry about the noise outside. I live on a roundabout, and cyclists like to show off the noise they can make with the motorcyclists like to show off the noises they can make with their bikes here. And I'll wait till he goes past.
It's fun because I can see it in the light across, going behind your back across the room.
That's very funny.
Here they really love, or in my neighborhood, they do donuts.
Oh, that sounds bad.
If you, it's loud. That's all. Okay, so complex PTSD, and why you like the term, but it has limitations. You use it despite your apprehension.
So I guess the concerns I have about complex PTSD as a term is that I guess I'm always aware that most of the trauma theory to which we have access, most of the theorization about trauma is so sort of Western centric in its perspective about what constitutes disorderedness, what constitutes the normal, what constitutes a disruption of that normal. So we have evidence, for instance, that when practitioners tried to sort of do PTSD therapy with people in the global South, it was actively damaging. And obviously it's so different for different groups, but our understanding of what constitutes trauma is so dependent, for instance, on our idea of community and the individual. It's so dependent on our idea of time and how it works, that these are sort of fundamental cultural assumptions. And so I'm always very sort of dubious about talking about PTSD and about trauma as anything but kind of cultural constructs. But for me, it's a cultural construct that can be helpful because I live in a world in which I can say to somebody, I have complex PTSD, and they'll be like, okay, I kind of get it now. You know, it's a word that is useful for making yourself understood, even though it's a really imperfect understanding, of course, because all words are really imperfect ways of understanding each other. So actually, for me to use the term complex PTSD rather than going into a more kind of involved and knotty explanation, that for me is a sort of almost an act of discipline I do for myself, to be like, no, don't be so arrogant, use the imperfect word. You are subject to language in the same way that everyone is subject to language, and you are as well or as badly represented by it as anyone else. So yeah, that's I guess that's what I'd say. And also just remembering that the very concept of thinking about trauma is a really one of the things I always find really interesting about trauma, because I teach trauma, I teach trauma literature at the University of Bristol. One of the things that always fascinates me is that the idea of trauma came from, fundamentally, it's the creation of the insurance system. Like, oh, this is super interesting. So it comes out of the introduction of the railways in Victorian England, and people were going on the railways and coming off feeling really kind of shaken and bad. And so they invented this condition called railway spine to explain people's sort of like painful feeling. It's one of these amazing invented, like, well, I suppose we have to remember that all conditions are kind of invented, right? One of these sort of very culturally and temporally specific health conditions, railway spine. And so the fact of having to locate, then the insurance companies were like, hang on, we don't want to pay out all this money to people who've got railway spine. So the fact of having to prove and locate a particular traumatic experience, that all comes out of the insurance companies. Yeah, if that makes sense. The insurance companies being like, hang on, we need to, I'm explaining this really badly. Let me try again. Basically, in the West, again, we have a tradition of not really respecting the psychological. We only respect the physical when it comes to illness. So there was a desire in the insurance, on the insurance companies' parts, to kind of find out the pathology behind the kind of distress people were experiencing after the event. And sort of in the process of doing that, the kind of bundle term trauma was emerged, not necessarily at the time, but that was the kind of the root of it, out of which it emerged, right? That there was a kind of bundling of psychological and physical symptoms that kind of made the condition honourable in such a way that compensation could be paid. Do you see what I mean? A similar thing, so a sort of parallel thing happens with shell shock during the First World War, where people are coming home sort of clearly what we would now call traumatized, like having flashbacks, unable to function, sometimes unable to speak. And they're like, obviously we can't say there's anything psychologically wrong with these people. It's a physiological thing that's happening because, shells have exploded near them. So I'm always just very conscious about the roots of this, the idea of trauma in a kind of capitalist medicalizing history. And I use the term trauma, I teach the term trauma. I also think a lot about ways to kind of trouble the idea of trauma, or sort of, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Kind of confuse the limitations of it as a way of understanding, or basically always remembering that it's a cultural construct. It's a very useful cultural construct, but it is a construct.
I think it's also, just hearing you talk about it, it's expanding what is considered trauma. And I think that when you were talking, like a bunch of little like ahas happened in my head. Like I feel like growing up, I grew up with depression and anxiety, which is neither here nor there. I kind of think everybody does, just certain people talk about it and I talk about it. I mean, maybe that's not true. I have no evidence either way. But anyway, if there was when I was 13, I got my appendix out for no particular reason, except for, I think I was feeling depressed. And there's sort of like, there was some sort of like recognition of like, if they could see it, if they could pinpoint, like I was in pain, then there was something, I don't know, I could be seen in a way. And I think that there's something in the book when you talk about love and love requiring being seen. Can you talk a little bit more about how the sort of complex experiences that you've had has sort of impacted the way you feel like you love and can be loved?
Oh, hugely. I think it's the biggest question for my life going forward, how to love and be loved. As a sort of person of colour who grew up in the global South, people have very particular expectations about what I'm for as a person, what they can expect of me and what they can get out of me. The expectation is often I'm going to be a sort of a good listener, I'm going to be gentle, I'm going to be predictable in certain kinds of ways, I'm going to be straight, I'm going to be all of these things. And I think that the more, I guess, racialized You are, and I think I cannot begin to imagine how appalling it must be for Black people. Yeah, like that must be next level. For me, even, it's been a lot. I think we are very bad at seeing each other at the best of times. I think if you are not racialized and if you're not a minoritized gender, it's people find it even harder to see you. And the particular, and it started really in Pakistan, where there was nobody to see me and nobody to help. If there had been anybody to help, I wouldn't have been able to explain what was happening, because what could I say? There was nothing happening that wasn't like normal, I guess. Yes.
I think something that I think potentially may be helpful for illustrating this is that you didn't speak can you talk about speaking the language?
Yeah.
So in a very literal sense, there was no
Yeah.
one to ask for help because you couldn't.
We were profoundly isolated, to the extent that my first language is English. As you can hear, my accent is super British, and people and it comes from my mother, because we just spent all this time shut up together. So people often either don't believe or actively say, well, that can't be true, when I tell them I was born and raised in Pakistan, or they assume I had a sort of super privileged international school life, at some sort of like weird boarding school. But no, I was just kept in such massive isolation that I didn't have an opportunity to pick up the accents around me. It was in Pakistan at that time, it was very, most schools would punish you if you spoke in anything but English, because the understanding of language was that, English was a language you needed to be good at to get ahead in life. So, we have analogies in the UK where, it sounds barbaric now, but in the past, kids were sort of punished for speaking Welsh or Gaelic in schools, and that's still going on all over the in post-colonial countries today. So it was the sort of linguistic isolation as well, and it's one of the greatest sadnesses actually of my life that my Odo was so bad. But yeah, it bespeaks how isolated we were.
I think going back to the bad at being seen or being invisible and not being able to ask for help. Can you talk too about what sort of help you were longing for, and the sort of idea that there was no way out and nothing to kind of long for, if that makes sense, and as well as the thinking about your drives to school and looking out on the flat landscapes and how potentially you found solace in that, or a way to escape, I guess, in some ways.
Yeah. My sense of what my future held as a sort of younger child was very, very small. I mean, the best case scenario for my life would be not having to marry, being allowed not to marry, get an education at university level with as many art subjects as I could possibly sort of like connive my way into being able to do. But the thing that was always there was that at some point I'd have to marry, and I can piece together what would have happened. We weren't allowed to speak to boys, any boys outside the house. So there's no way I would meet anyone. So it would ultimately, the marriage would have been arranged in one way or another, and it would have been, my father was so sort of protective is too positive a word, so controlling, that it'd be someone he'd picked, really. And it'd probably have been one of his students. He was a doctor and he taught medicine. One of his proteges he'd sort of groomed to support him and idolize him. And I'm a queer woman. I didn't know that at that time, but I knew that this would be an appalling outcome. Even if I'd seen my mother's life as well, just an absolute drudge, and this looked like the most appalling life, and that's all I had to look forward to. So life was not a fun thing, But actually, when I came to the UK and suddenly, and it all happened very suddenly, the disown, suddenly we were in the UK and now we lived here. And suddenly all of these options opened up. And I didn't have the machinery inside me to accommodate all of this. And it felt very unreal. It still does, really. Like, all of this feels very unreal. Even now, and I've been in the UK now more than half my life. Like, when you don't have any option to hope that things will get better, like, I think yeah, I think you can lose that capacity to accommodate hope. I don't know, maybe it grows back for some people. Maybe some people have a more robust one than I do or did. But yeah, so life always seemed like a very bleak thing to me, to be kind of endured, or to do as much good to the world as I possibly could while I was in it. And that partly comes from my mother, who's very oriented around service in many ways. Our life might have gone a bit differently if she'd felt differently about her responsibilities to the world. So there didn't seem to be much in it for me, life or other people. And we were brought up as well to, my father would say over and over again, other people are stupid, other people are wrong, other people are deluded, stay away from them, nothing good can come of them. So I was brought up with a kind of deep contempt for other people, as well as this loneliness. And all, everything about sort of the Pakistani culture I did encounter seemed to sort of, to my sort of brainwashed child mind seemed to back that up. Like, the emphasis on sort of on sociality, on things like weddings. I was like, what's the point of all these weddings where you sit around and just gossip? But of course, it's a crucial mode of the social. So learning how to be interested in other people, but that was part of it, but also how to make myself knowable to other people, a huge dilemma, again, partly because of that difficulty in giving an account of myself. And that's actually one of the epigraphs of the book, is from a book by Judith Butler, Giving an Account of Oneself, because I'm fascinated by the idea, how do you give an account of oneself? Is it ever possible to give an account of yourself? What does it mean? And yet, why is it something that we are so desperate to do, to give an account of ourselves? And what Butler says fundamentally is impossible to give an account of yourself, obviously. But I felt I had no way of explaining why there was just a kind of gap in my life where experience should have been. And people don't, and actually people find it very, when I tell people my experiences, they find it very hard to remember them. I find this phenomenon very interesting. I'll tell people, I grew up in a very isolated environment. I only speak English. I was kept indoors for a long time. I came over to the UK when I was 16. They'll be like, oh, right, okay, interesting. And then if it ever comes up again, they'll be like, oh, yeah, I'd forgotten you were so old when you came over. I'd got it in my head that you were like 3 or something, like you were a much younger child. There's something about, so that gives you the feeling there's something about your story that is so kind of impossible, that even when you are so direct about it and you tell the story, it cannot be assimilated by them, because it makes no sense. So the idea that there's something fundamentally not just untellable about the story, but also unrememberable, that it's so fundamentally narratively impossible that its hearers can't retain it. And partly that relates to what I was saying earlier about the expectations people have about people of colour, and about sort of people who've moved from one country to another, what their experiences are. People have a whole set of assumptions about that. So that makes it very difficult to connect, and that makes connection feel very tiring. But also, the last thing I'll say here is that complex post-traumatic stress disorder is often spoken of as identical, or as a piece with relational trauma. When bad things were done to you over a long period of time by people who should have looked after you, what that is a continuous and fundamental disruption of relationship. You grow up feeling like other people are basically untrustable, that the very people who should have cared for you most are the ones who really let you down in this big way. And so it's very hard for me to feel safe with other people. It's very hard for me to feel that it's possible for me to be present with other people. So either I can be a receptacle for them, or I can be on my own. Those are my choices. That being with other people means not giving up on being in my world. We always have to go into their world, because my world is somehow senseless or chaotic or narratively impossible in that way. That was a long answer to your question.
Oh no, but it was a really beautiful one. And I think from as as a person who actually, I think I had I think I had a very privileged childhood, despite what my teenager self would have said, if that makes any sense. But thinking about, when I think about how the understanding of when someone tells me a story about a complexity in their life, I don't think, for me, I remember them, I feel like in my head, the narrative that I'm telling myself is that I remember them acutely. I just don't know how to talk about them in a way that feels respectful, or like, and this could be total bullshit, that this is just a story that I've created around myself.
No, this is really interesting.
But I think, like, and I also don't know if you want to talk about it. For example, like, if there's an openness that or a generosity that you've given thus far, but also it's difficult to know. It's so much easier psychologically to say nothing, and then have you internalize that as it doesn't exist.
Yes,
Makes so much sense.
And all of this comes from, like, I don't think people are bad. You're right. It's just massively, like, socially awkward and confusing to be like, what do I say now? Is she upset? Do we change the subject? Totally.
But I also think it's like, on the part of the listener or the receiver, like, it's uncomfortable to hear things. And it's self-protective, like, avoidance almost as well. I think that I don't know, is either good or bad. That we're almost out of time, but that reminds me of when you talk about your father. There's this thing you say, when your father died, or he was not, what do you say? He was not a bad man because he was loved by many people. And I feel like you take this neutrality to people, even there was something really factual or like distanced in the language of talking about this man who had done horrific things. I was wondering if you could kind of talk about holding both the truth of your experience and the reality that he was good in the eyes of so many people.
Yeah. I guess when I was writing the book, I feel very aware now of my tremendous, impossible, ludicrous good luck in life. I was saying to a friend today, like, the review of my book came out in the New York Times yesterday, and I was saying to a colleague I met in the street, I actually don't think there's anything else I want to do with my life. Like, literally, like, I feel like I'm done. Not in a like scary way, just not like, yeah, okay, everything I wanted to do is done, maybe now's the time to, start like campaigning on the streets. Like, I've run out of personal ambition, really. Let's see if that changes, but that's where I am at this exact moment on the 7th of June 2023. I am insanely lucky. Like, every day I am overwhelmed by the insaneness of my luck. And I can look, like, my father was very big and very scary when I was little, but I can see now the position he was in a much clearer way. He didn't have a British passport, I don't think. Not sure about that, actually. I have access to things he never could. He was racialized, even, he didn't have this accent. This accent, talking about luck as well and structural privilege, this accent has opened so many doors for me. Without question, I would not be sitting where I am now if I had a Pakistani accent. Change nothing else, just change the accent, and my life would not have gone this well. That's just the fact. People are incredibly racist. So my father's first language wasn't English. He felt like really sort of sidelined, and people were racist towards him. He was vastly intelligent, but he was racialized. So there's that. And am also so aware that narratively I win. Narratively, everyone's on my side. Because we have so many stories. This is the other thing that I sort of like wandered away from, talking about the other sort of story I didn't want to tell, which is there's this genre of misery memoirs where bad things happen to people in the East or in the global South, and then they escape. Or bad things happen in Islam and then people escape. Basically, Islam is the baddies, and it is so much more complicated than that. What I'm always what I try to always remember is that my father was a post-colonial subject in a country. Pakistan is profoundly traumatized by colonialism. Colonialism has left Pakistan in this kind of frozen, rigid, unendable horror. It was founded on a kind of an idea, it was founded to be a homeland for Muslims. But what does that mean? Which Muslims? There are so many ways of practicing Islam. Is that all Muslims in the subcontinent, or just the Muslims in the Muslim majority regions that eventually became Pakistan? What does that mean? It was founded on the basis of a story which doesn't internally make sense. And forever after, it's been locked in this kind of identity crisis. Pakistan's one of the most sidelined, maligned, misunderstood countries on earth. It is incredibly complicated in a way that people don't want to concede. So yeah, from that point of view, I'm really lucky, and I'm much luckier in many ways than my father was. And part, I think, of growing up, just anyway, is understanding that your parents did their best. Sometimes your parents could have done better. And I think that in an ideal world, and I say this in the book, everybody makes decisions about who gets to be human. And have access, by that I mean have access to the full set of kind of human feelings and rights and emotions and potential for actualizing themselves. Every time anyone buys anything off Amazon, they are temporarily allowing themselves to forget that the people who work in appalling conditions in Amazon warehouses are human. So everyone makes decisions about the humanity of other people and how consistently they allow it to be present to them. And I write in the book that what my father did was, it just happened that the person that wasn't human to him was me. But fundamentally, we all do that. We all dehumanize other people. So my beef with him is not an objective beef, it is a personal beef. I would have liked him to see me as human. But then, I buy clothes from shops which may or may not be stitched by slaves. I'm sure those people would like to be consistently human to me in the same way. We are all implicated in this. Does that make sense? That's where I am in relation to him. So I don't blame him, but I also don't forgive him.
That is interesting. I've never thought about it holding both of those at the same time. You don't blame him and you don't forgive him. Those seem like they can't work together.
Yeah, it's one of the weird paradoxes, isn't it? Like, he behaved as, within the normal, I would say, it wouldn't have been acceptable Western parenting, but from the perspective of, many worse things happen to children in Pakistan. Like, within the kind of ways that children in Pakistan are treated, it's, people probably, other Pakistanis will look at my life and be like, yeah, in terms of the fact that he considered me his property, that's not abnormal. So within the cultural framework he was in, it was fairly, in many ways, in certain ways, fairly standard, in many ways not standard at all. But I can also say to myself, well, what he did had a really bad impact on me, and I retain a personal beef about that.
Can you talk, you don't talk super much about the concept of forgiveness. Like it's threaded as an undercurrent, or it's something for me, I don't know if that you intended this, and I don't know if this is accurate at all, that in going and experiencing and talking about things with a certain amount of distance, there's an implied forgiveness or okayness. Maybe it's different. Can you talk, I think, because we're running super out of time.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Oh no,
by the way, like I said I've blocked out an hour. I've got more time. I just don't want to hold you up, fundamentally. So you might have another thing.
Really fun, exciting accounting phone call accounting.
So fun.
It's actually not, or I mean, I avoid it like a lot, or I mean, I guess it's like I don't want to go, but I have to. This is way more fun than talking about that. But could you close a little bit? I'm kind of conflicted on what I want you to close on, in the sense that, like, what's next, in a weird way, because it's not an tying back to where we started as it being not an inspirational story, and yet now you've just disclosed that being written up in the New York Times, like what else is there? And also the sort of complicated nature of being hopeless. But I'm assuming this is a good day for you in the sense that you've received, your book came out yesterday, and you're being seen maybe in different and new ways.
I mean, that's been one of the most extraordinary and unexpected things about the book coming out, because it's been out in the UK for like a month and a bit now, maybe like a month and a week or a month and 2 weeks, not quite sure. But I was just bowled over by like the whole process, where my agent was telling me, yes, this makes sense to me. My editor's saying this makes sense to me. And then readers saying this makes sense to me. And more than that, I've had the most beautiful, beautiful messages from people, not just with CPTSD, but people with depression, people with autism, and most meaningfully to me, I mean, it's also meaningfully to me, but what has had a special place in my heart is people of colour writing to me and saying, you've put into words something that wasn't available to me before, and that's made a big difference. So I think actually the experience of publishing this book, it's not over yet, but it seems to me like it might, when this is over, I might know something new about connection, or what it means to feel connected. That's going on now, so I'm just learning, I'm just watching and learning right now, observing myself and noticing how I feel. But yeah, I was being flippant when I said really that there's nothing more to do, because the big question is still the same. How do we love each other? Like the New York Times review is fundamentally great, but it's so great, but nothing really matters except learning how to love other people and learning how to be loved by them, which is the harder thing, I think. Yeah, I think that'll take my whole life to figure out.
Do you think it harder for you in the sense that like accepting that love?
Oh yeah, it's very vulnerable to accept love. I'm very good at loving things, but to be loved means allowing myself to be fully present, and allowing myself, taking the risk of giving an account of yourself to the other person and trusting that they will hold it in a way that's good, and not dropping you or betraying you or dismissing you. I mean, that's been a ubiquitous experience. That's incredibly scary when people have always kind of, or consistently in the past, let you down in that way and not held you. Taking the risk of being present to another person. And it's an odd one, because I don't mind writing about it. I don't mind talking about it, as we are here. But yeah, the kind of to bring that into intimacy with another person, that's terrifying. And that's something I'm gonna have to learn to figure out.
Well, thank you so much, Noreen, for doing this. I'm sorry we ran out of time. A flat plate out now in the US and Canada, out yesterday. Seriously, when Stephanie and I started reading it, we were like, this is really good.
Thank you.
It's weird to say that it's kind of like an emotional thriller as well.
What a lovely way of putting it. That's great.
Well, no, it's fucked up, because it's like someone's sort of experience, difficult experience, but the way that it's written is very thrilling, as well as extremely poetic. And I like that I like that you said that too. People, it really does give words to the experience of hopelessness and trying to connect in a way that, and also finding other connections in landscapes and objects and in text and in art. And I think that those are really important coping tools that are often overlooked. So thank you so much, Noreen, for doing this, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
You take care. Bye.